So let's head back to business now, switch up the business mood, and then the first thing that pops up, of course, is the tariff of Liberation Day yesterday by U.S. President Donald Trump. Announcement of various tariffs that we saw, the list being 10%. I think Nigeria falls in the category of 14%. So let's find out how this is going to affect us in the coming days with the Chief Executive Officer of Carrier Asset Management Limited, Mr. Johnson Chukwu. Mr. Chukwu, good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So yesterday, 9 p.m., everybody was looking the way of the White House. President Trump called it Liberation Day. But how do you see the spillover of these tariffs? We know China is the biggest hit, but we also have ours as the African countries and all that. Although we're supposed to have AGOA to protect us, but it doesn't seem that will protect us at this time. How much impact do you see this tariff affecting Nigeria and Africa?
Let me sum up with an article I'm trying to put together on this tariff. And that article is titled, Donald Trump's Tariff, A New Beginning or Beginning of an End. And I think the tariff as it stands today will eventually signpost the beginning of the failing of U.S. or the collapse of U.S. as a leading economic and world power. The simple reason is this. For the first time in the history of the U.S., is picking up fight with even its closest enemies. If you look at that tariff, for instance, you mentioned the tariff on Nigeria, which is inconsequential because Nigeria is a net importer from the U.S., not a net exporter from the U.S. Nigeria's import from the U.S. in the last quarter of last year was about 6.36% of our total import, about 1 trillion Naira. But how much does the U.S. currently import from Nigeria? It has actually diminished at a significant level. But back to the aspect I'm relating to, which is the core of your question. The U.S. tariff will eventually hurt U.S. and hurt international trade and hurt the friendly countries. Take, for instance, the imposition of tariff, 20% tariff on European Union. European Union is the closest economic ally of the U.S. It also imposed a 24% tariff on South Korea, one of its closest economic allies, and on Japan, and 25% on South Korea. These are countries that the U.S. have had very close formal economic relationship with. In addition to that, of course, China, we can always explain China's case because China is a trade deficit with the U.S. is humongous. I mean, in favor of China. But the 54% tariff on China, and you can be rest assured that these countries are going to retaliate. Of course, they are already statement by world leaders that they are going to reciprocate the reciprocal tariff, because that's what the U.S. president called it, reciprocal tariff. They are going to reciprocate in kind the reciprocal tariffs. So we're going to see a situation where price levels are going to go up in U.S., inflation is going to go up in U.S., possibly unemployment could actually go up, and the intended purpose of driving back manufacturing into the U.S. as well as generating revenue will be defeated.
Encourage domestic manufacturing in the U.S.?
Come again.
I said, don't you think this will also incentivize domestic manufacturing for the United States?
Yeah, you know, the truth about businessmen, they are not driven by threats. Businessmen are going to be driven by core economic factors. The first thing that will happen is that the U.S. is going to constrain import of raw materials. Of course, I know there are some exceptions they granted for products they believe they don't produce. So, but ultimately, they're going to, because other countries will also impose reciprocal tariffs. So they're going to constrain import of raw materials that are critical to manufacturing. Today, they've driven away labor from Mexico, from other neighboring countries, from other countries that we are providing cheap labor in the U.S. Labor costs are going to go up in the U.S. And at the same time, price of imported goods, as well as even locally manufactured goods that tariffs have been imposed on their input materials, will go up. So households in America will find it difficult to consume the same quantity of goods and services they used to consume, which means you're going to see a decline in consumption. If you see a decline in consumption, manufacturers will not have any incentive to improve manufacturing. Likewise, companies that are currently manufacturing outside the outside the U.S. will rather intensify their manufacturing activities and sell to markets outside of the U.S. U.S. GDP is about 25 to 27 trillion dollars. China is in the region of 17 trillion dollars. By the time you add India, add European Union, add Japan, and all these countries are going to start trading among themselves, excluding U.S. or ignoring U.S. So the economic size of that global trade, excluding U.S., is significant that manufacturers will rather stay in Mexico, in the European Union, in India, in Vietnam, in China, and possibly, if we make ourselves attractive, in Nigeria, and produce for the rest of the world and ignore America. And that's why I said in my article that I'm putting together, is this Donald Trump tariff, is it a beginning of a new era, like he said, that this Liberation Day, or is it a beginning, that is it beginning of a new era or beginning of an end? So I think this will signpost the end of the U.S. economic hegemony.
Well, time will tell, Mr. Johnson Chukwu. Thank you so much. But just before we let you go, let's see our Naira. We're just starting a new quarter. How the Naira fared in the first quarter. So I know that in January, for January 2025, the Naira closed at about 1,475 for a dollar, marking its strongest performance since June 2024. In February, there was about an 8.5% gain. I remember it was in February we had a convergence between the parallel and the official markets, a beautiful thing that we hardly have. So it closed about 1,500 in February. In March, the central bank is saying that the Naira ended the month around 1,536 Naira 82 kobo, marking a loss, a drop of 37 Naira 84 kobo compared to what it started with at the beginning of March. Remember, in 2024, the Naira was termed one of the worst performing currencies in the world. When we look at the performance in the first quarter, Mr. Johnson, would you say we are out of the woods, at least in the area of stability in value?
Well, I think it would be hasty to say we're out of the wood. What I would say is that the central bank is doing a relatively good job in managing the exchange rates, in maintaining some level of stability within a bracket of 1,490 to 1,550 Naira to a dollar. That has, they've been able to sustain that over the past 3 months. And what have they done? Because you have to look at what tools are available at their disposal. I think the most effective tool at their disposal is the use of treasury bills and more instruments to manage the foreign exchange demand, as well as manage foreign portfolio inflows. And they have done that effectively well. So, but there are still too many variables out there that could weaken or constrain the ability of the central bank to manage the FX. One of which is the budget deficit. Depending on the size of the budget deficit, I think the federal government has budgeted about 13 trillion Naira the budget deficit. But last year, they budgeted about 8 trillion Naira budget deficit and ended with about 12 trillion Naira budget deficit. That is almost 50%, about almost 50% variance, negative variance. So, and as you stand today, the government has a budget, a trade revenue that look optimistic, extremely optimistic. So we may see another situation where the budget deficit could widen beyond what they had projected, and that will put pressure on the ability of the central bank to manage the FX. And that factor that could constrain the central bank is oil prices and oil production. If oil prices drop precipitously or crude production drop materially, then the central bank's war chest or capacity to manage the exchange rate will be constrained. But all the same, the central bank has done a relatively good job. We've seen, like I said, we've seen some level of stability in exchange rates, and I hope that they will be able to maintain that, and there won't be any counterbalancing effort by a measure or policy by the fiscal authorities that will erode the effectiveness of what the central bank has done in managing the FX rates.
So you think at this rate, because, for instance, I think one of the applaudable efforts of the CBN is the EFM, the Electronic Foreign Exchange Market System. A lot of people have applauded that it's brought transparency to the system and improved sentiment, positive sentiment. Would you say that if we continue at the trend, the rate we are, do you see any addition to the value, or we should just accept that this is the new value of the Naira and perhaps just find ways to maintain it?
Like I said, today, our external factor of the external factors of the economy may not sustain or support a materially stronger Naira. Because one, you have to look at your export earnings and you look at your import earnings. In the last quarter of last year, total export was about 20 trillion Naira. Import was about 15.6 trillion Naira, giving us a positive trade balance of just about 3 trillion Naira. But beyond that, you also know that there are other obligations inherent in our foreign exchange reserve. Of course, the central bank said yesterday or 2 days ago that our net foreign exchange reserve is about 23 billion Naira, which looks good. But beyond that, what matters is your inflow and outflow. And your inflow is driven largely by your trade, your export. Today, our major export remains crude oil. And that crude oil export could come under severe pressure. I understand OPEC can reduce our production quota, OPEC quota, but that's not actually a major constraint for us. Our greatest constraint is our ability to produce crude, maintain some level of stability in the crude-producing regions of the Niger Delta, and continue to pump out crude, as well as encourage investment that will increase our crude production. But the factor that's outside our control is the crude price. With what Donald Trump has done with a new tariff order, we're likely going to see material decline in global production, which will mean that there will also be decline in input demand. And our crude is one of the inputs that drive economic activities. So if there's a slowdown in economic activity, you may see a slowdown in crude demand, which could lead to a precipitous decline in crude prices. That will constrain the central bank's ability to manage the exchange rate at current levels. But all things being equal, assuming all things are equal, I guess we should expect Cowley's projection of exchange rate is between 1,450 Naira to $1 to 1,650 Naira to $1 for this current fiscal year.
So would that be your outlook for the second quarter? Was that a longer term?
Yes, that's the outlook for the entire year. And I think those are outlooks. The outlook remains the same, 1,450 to $1 to between 1,450 Naira to $1 and 1,650 Naira to $1. That's our outlook for the second quarter of this year as well. All things being equal, I keep emphasizing all things being equal. Variables could change very quickly. You just mentioned at your earlier part of this program that crude price dropped in a single day by $2. And I think that drop will continue for the rest of today.
All right, thank you so much, Group CEO of Tariffs Asset Management Limited, Mr. Johnson Chukwu.
Thank you for having me.